onward, on to scroll number 7. The weeping man wiped his nose angrily on his arm and then bent down. He picked up a pine cone, drew back his arm and threw it at Scuto. It fell short and the man sobbed again. "Get away!" He began looking round for other missiles, but the 3 of them had already turned and were running back towards the road. Scuto loped behind them, still wagging his tail as if it were a game. "Is the man following us?" gasped Flavia when they reached the road again. "No, I don't think so," said Jonathan. He was wheezing a bit. While she waited for him to catch his breath, Flavia joined Nubia in patting Scuto. "Don't worry, Scuto," she said in a soothing voice. "We won't let the bad man get you." "Not bad man," said Nubia. Flavia and Jonathan both looked up at her in surprise. "Sad man." "But that's probably the man who killed Bobus," Jonathan cried. "You may be right," agreed Flavia. "But how can we be sure?" "I know," Flavia said after a moment's thought. "We'll all hide and wait for him to go back into the town. When he does, you follow him, Jonathan. Try to find out who he is and where he lives. Nubia and I will go back to the little tomb and look for clues there. Then we'll meet back at my house. All right?" "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's wait beside that tomb in the shade." The 3 of them sat on a soft layer of dust and pine needles and rested their backs against the shady wall of a large decrepit tomb. Fragrant dill and thyme bushes screened them from the road, but they could see anyone who came along. For a long time no one passed. The only sound was the slow creaking of the cicadas and Scuto's steady, rhythmic panting. Flavia gazed at the tombs around them. They were like small houses, with doors so that new urns could be added. Some had inscriptions above the doors, others had pictures painted on their outer walls, like the 2 faded gladiators shown fighting on a tomb near the road. Flavia's own family had a tomb further down the road, for the Gemini family had now been in Ostia for 3 generations. She often went there with her father to honour her mother and tiny twin brothers. Half-buried amphora, those are wine and olive oil jars. Half-buried amphora marked the graves of the poorer people. Wine could be poured into their necks to refresh the ashes of the dead below. Presently, an old man leading a tiny donkey passed slowly down the road towards the town. He had loaded the little beast high with firewood. They could hear him singing snatches of a song and talking to himself. Then he was gone, and the road was empty again. "I don't think he's coming this way," Flavia whispered to Jonathan at last, "unless we've missed him." "No, we haven't missed him. Wait here. I'll see if he's still at the tomb." He crept off, but a few minutes later he stood before them. "He's gone," said Jonathan. "But you must come and look at the tomb. Come quickly." "To the gods of the underworld," Flavia read, "sacred to the memory of my poor Evita, 8 years old." The 3 of them and Scuto stood before the little tomb while Flavia read out the Latin inscription painted over the tiny door. "There's a picture on this side," said Jonathan. They all moved round to the side of the tomb. Someone had painted a fresco of a little girl lying on a funeral couch, surrounded by mourners. The colours look strangely bright and cheerful for the subject. A fresco is a painting that is made on wet plaster, and it has to be made when it's wet, and then you get a long-lasting image. "Little girl," said Nubia sadly. "Yes," said Flavia softly. "Probably his daughter. But where did he go? The only way back is along the road." said Jonathan, unless his house backs onto the graveyard like ours. That would mean he lives in our street, said Flavia. I wonder how we could find out, mused Jonathan, nibbling a stalk of dried grass. I know just the person to ask, cried Flavia. I suppose there is a lot of sad stuff here about families and children being lost. I think it is part of our learning in history that we live in an incredibly fortunate time where our NHS and our scientific understanding means that things like childbirth are remarkably safe compared with circumstances during history. And so there would, unfortunately, in Roman times have been memorials like this, and it's a really, really sad part of history, but I think we should hold on to the fact that we are so fortunate in the West with our knowledge and the money we have that means we can be comparatively safe in contrast with people throughout history, certainly with people in Rome. They stood in Flavia's kitchen, munching grapes and sipping cool water from ceramic cups. Scuto was drinking long and deeply from his water bowl. Alma bent over the kitchen hearth, stirring a pan of chicken barley soup and nodding her head. Yes, I remember something about a little girl. Her father was a sailor. They lived just up our street. The father adored the girl, hated to be away from her. That's right. The girl's name was Avita Procula, and his name was Publius Avitus Proculus. Came back from a voyage a week or two ago to find she'd died. Alma reached up and took a pinch of rosemary from a dried bundle which hung from the ceiling. She lived just up the road? Asked Jonathan. Yes, said Alma, crumbling the herb into the soup. The house right on the bend. How did Avita die? Asked Flavia. Do you know? Oh my, yes, sighed Alma as she resumed stirring. But I never mentioned it to you, dear. I didn't want to give you nightmares. They all looked at Alma. She stopped stirring for a moment and faced them gravely. She died, I'm afraid, of hydrophobia. And when they can turn to stare at her blankly, she explained in a whisper, a mad dog bit her. Hydrophobia nowadays, I believe, is the disease called rabies. And one of the features of the illness is that people stop wanting to be anywhere near water, which is what hydrophobia means. So the word hydrophobia means a fear of water. People suffering from hydrophobia are terrified of water, even their own saliva. Jonathan, standing behind his father, allowed some spittle to bubble out of his mouth, looked down at it, and opened his eyes in mock horror. Flavia and Nubia tried not to giggle. Mordecai went on. Victims also lose their appetite. Jonathan pretended to refuse an imaginary plate. Suffer hallucinations? Jonathan opened his eyes wide again and screamed silently, brushing wildly at imaginary insects crawling on his arms. Flavia bit her lip to stop from laughing. Nubia covered her mouth with her hand. So hallucinations are when you imagine you can see something that isn't really there, and eventually become paralysed. Jonathan clapped his hands to his sides, went stiff as a plank, and crossed his eyes. The girls, unable to contain themselves any longer, burst out laughing. Mordecai glanced up at them briefly. Jonathan, please, he said without looking round. It's not a laughing matter. He read on. The disease is also known as rabies, which means a raging. Let's see what Pliny has to say. I have his new volume here somewhere. Who is Pliny? Asked Flavia. He's the admiral of the Roman fleet and a brilliant historian, said Mordecai as he shuffled through the scrolls on the table. He's just written a superb natural history in 37 volumes. Lives just down the coast from here. Ah! Jonathan's father held a scroll to the lamp, for it was nearly dusk and the light was fading quickly. Yes, here's what Pliny says about rabies. Greatest danger of human catching it is when the dog star is shining. That's now. It causes fatal hydrophobia. To prevent a dog from catching this disease, mix chicken dung in its food. Chicken dung would be chicken waste, chicken poo. Pliny the Elder is quite famous for his really rather weird medical opinions. I don't think chicken poo in food is necessarily going to prevent rabies. Jonathan screwed up his face and stuck his tongue out. Mordecai smiled indulgently at their laughter, then suddenly hissed at them to be quiet. They all heard a strangled cry and the sound of barking. They're in the graveyard again, cried Mordecai between clenched teeth, but this time I'm ready. The doctor hurried out of the study and ran upstairs, almost tripping on his long robe. Jonathan, Flavia and Nubia followed him into a narrow bedroom with one small window. Under the window, a small pile of stones lay on an octagonal table, and next to them a bow and arrow. Mordecai pushed his head out and they heard him grunt. There they are. He reached for the bow and arrow and aimed it through the window. Jonathan and Flavia jostled to see, but the window was too small. Mordecai was blocking their view. Quickly, cried Jonathan. The other bedroom has a window. Follow me. The girls followed Jonathan into a second narrow... Oh, I'm on to scroll 8. Got carried away. The girls followed Jonathan into a second narrow bedroom with bright mustard yellow walls. They ran to the window and Jonathan yanked out a wooden latticework screen that fitted into its frame. Peering through, they were just in time to see Mordecai's arrow fly into the midst of the pack of dogs which surrounded a tall umbrella pine. The arrow missed. The mad dogs swarmed around the tree, barking loudly and gazing up into it. Use your sling, Flavia urged Jonathan. I can't. There's not enough room in here to swing it. I need to be outside. Their 3 faces crowded into the tiny window frame. What are they barking at? Asked Jonathan. There's something up that tree. Yes, agreed Jonathan. There's something on the other side, clinging on. It was difficult to see in the fading light. I can see hands. Or maybe paws, said Flavia. Boy, said Nubia. No, it can't be a boy. Look how fast it's climbing now, cried Jonathan. It must be a monkey, gasped Flavia. The dogs had stopped barking and were watching the climber with interest too. Suddenly the creature moved round the trunk and they could all see its silhouette against the yellow sky of dusk. The creature was not a monkey, but a boy, no more than 8 years old. As they watched in amazement, he shouted incoherently down at the dogs, not a scream of fear, but a mocking taunt. This enraged the dogs, who began to bark furiously again. Another arrow whizzed down from the window. This one found its mark. One of the dogs yelped, leapt into the air, then fell back with a shaft in his gut. The others sniffed at him, and when a second arrow struck the leader, they ran off into the woods. 2 dogs with arrows in them lay on the ground. High up in the tree, the small boy clung to the trunk. Let's help the boy, cried Jonathan, and ran downstairs with the girls close behind him. Mordecai followed them down the stairs. Wait, he cried, don't go out. The dogs aren't dead yet. They may still be dangerous. But we have to help the boy, protested Jonathan. Yes, I know, his father reassured him as they reached the bottom of the stairs. "That's why I brought this." They all looked at the object Mordecai held in his hand. It was a large, curved sword. The blade was polished to mirror brightness, and its edge was sharp as a razor. The back of the house had no windows at ground level, so the three of them ran back upstairs to the yellow bedroom in order to watch. In the twilight, they saw Jonathan's father emerge cautiously from the back door beneath them. The white oval of his turban gleamed in the dusk. Below it they could see his blue shoulders and the flash of the sword. He moved slowly towards the pine tree, occasionally glancing up at the boy, but keeping a closer eye on the wounded dogs. The leader lay panting quietly, pinned to the ground by an arrow in its leg. The other, a bitch, writhed in agony with an arrow in her belly. The blade flashed as Mordecai cut the she-dog's throat with a single stroke, putting her out of her misery. But his action caused the leader to twist with alarm, and in so doing, the huge black mastiff freed himself from the ground. The wounded beast faced Mordecai and crouched. His lips curled back to reveal sharp, pale fangs dripping with saliva. The broken shaft protruded from his hind leg. Mordecai murmured something soothing, though they could not make out the words, but the wounded hound was not pacified. With an ugly snarl, he leapt directly at Mordecai's face. Jonathan's father reacted by instinct. The bloody sword flashed again, and the dog's head and body fell in two separate places. For a moment, no one moved. Then Flavia and her friends raced downstairs and out the back door. When they reached Mordecai, he was standing in the same spot, looking down at the two dead dogs and trembling. "Let me have the sword, father," said Jonathan quietly. Mordecai shook his head emphatically. "No, if these dogs are rabid, even the blood from the sword might be dangerous." He moved over to a clump of horsegrass and began wiping the blade clean. Flavia felt a tug at her arm. Nubia was pointing up at the tree. The boy, instead of coming down and thanking them for saving his life, was shimmying higher up the tree. "Come down," called Flavia. "The dogs are dead. It's safe." "They can't hurt you now," Jonathan added. But the boy had reached the larger limbs and was inching his way along one. His feet gripped the branch almost as tightly as his hands. They watched in fascination as he slowly stood up on it, remained still for a moment, and then leapt 6 feet towards another umbrella pine nearby. That's about my height, so he's jumped a fair distance from tree to tree. He caught hold of a branch with one arm, but it was a small one, and began to bend alarmingly. They gasped, but the boy had already swung on, using his momentum, and moved on to the next branch. There was an even larger gap between the tree he was in and the next one, which led to the woods beyond. "He'll never make it," gasped Flavia in horror, as the boy swung from the pine branch, preparing to jump. "We just might," breathed Jonathan. The boy leapt. He seemed suspended in air for a moment, and the 4 faces watching him seemed frozen too. Then, impossibly, he had grasped one of the pine's outermost branches and was swinging for the next sturdier limb. But as he swung forward, they all heard an ominous crack. Ominous means that something bad is going to happen, and you know it's going to happen, but there's not a lot you can do about it. It's going to go wrong. The branch, and the boy with it, plummeted to the earth below. "It's a miracle, but it seems no bones are broken," murmured Mordecai as he examined the boy. "Jonathan, could you bring the lampstand a bit nearer?" They were all standing round the boy, who lay on a couch in the mustard yellow bedroom. The boy's eyes were closed and his face was very pale, but he was breathing. Jonathan pulled a standing lamp closer to the bed, carefully so that the hot oil wouldn't spill. The light now shone full on the boy's face, and they could see he was exceedingly grubby. Smears of dirt streaked his face, and his tangled hair was full of dust and twigs. His tattered tunic smelled curiously of sour wine and pine resin. Abruptly, the boy opened his eyes. They glittered sea green in the lamplight, and for a moment they registered fear, but only for a moment. Then they grew alert and wary. "Peace be with you," said Mordecai with a little bow, and added, "Every stranger is an uninvited guest." The boy started to rise, but Mordecai pushed him gently back against the striped cushions piled on his bed. "Careful, my boy," he said softly. "You've taken a nasty fall. It's a miracle you've no broken bones." The boy settled back on the pillows and looked round at them, almost as if judging his chances of escape. "Jonathan, the bread, please," said Mordecai. Jonathan handed his father a plate with a flat, round loaf of bread on it. Mordecai tore a piece from the loaf and handed it to the boy. The boy didn't hesitate. He reached a hand out from under the covers, took the piece of bread, sniffed it quickly, and swallowed it almost whole. Flavian noticed that his fingernails were cracked and filthy. Mordecai set the plate carefully on the couch. The boy took another hunk of bread and devoured it. He ate like a dog, chomping once or twice with his molars, and then throwing his head back and swallowing the half-chewed bread in one gulp. Between bites, he looked constantly round at them, warily, suspiciously, as if at any moment one of them might suddenly lunge forward to steal his food. When he had finished the loaf, he drained a beaker of cold water. He wiped his mouth with his bare arm and pushed back the cover as if to go. No, Mordecai said gently, pressing him back on the bed. "You can't leave now. It's already dark outside. Let me get word to your family that you are all right. What's your name? And where do you live?" The boy looked at him silently, his mouth firmly closed. "We have shared bread together," explained Mordecai solemnly. "You are now under our protection. Please, tell us your name." He smiled encouragingly. The boy said nothing. "He doesn't understand us," said Jonathan. The boy shot him a furious look. "Oh, but I think he does," said Mordecai. "Young man," he said gently, "please open your mouth for me." The boy glared at him. "Please," said Mordecai softly. The boy opened his mouth slowly. Mordecai carefully held the boy's chin between thumb and forefinger and lowered it even more. Then he looked into the boy's mouth. After a moment he closed it again and looked gravely at the three of them. "He understands well enough," said the doctor, "but he is unable to reply. You see, someone has taken out his tongue."